welcome everybody today to the Family Medicine Grand Rounds for February 16th, 2022. Your activity code for today's session is listed there, 100876618. If you are wanting CME credit, you'll need to be sure to claim that credit before midnight tonight. And I'm going to go over, in case you haven't yet, in the next slide here, how you would get that credit. So you'll need to make sure that you're first registered in the system by texting your email address to the number listed there. Once you've done that, you will text the activity code for today. You'll text attend and then the code. But if you have any issues with that, please feel free to reach out and to contact me, and I'm happy to help. Also, as we get started here, I want to take a moment to remind everybody, if you could please make sure that your microphone is muted as we get started. Also, if you would make sure that you are attentive and engaged in the session. And then towards the end of the session, I'll be putting the link to the evaluation that we would like to see. If you could help us with some feedback, as well as the presenter, would really appreciate that. So I'll put that in the chat box towards the end. So this is the South Texas Regional Family Medicine Grand Rounds. Our partner is the South Central Area Health Education Center, and our mission statement is listed there. CME transcripts are available for this presentation. If you would like to, you can go to the CME office website. And again, you'll need to make sure you claim that credit before midnight tonight in order to do so. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them, or you can reach out to me as well. And then we are also offering credit through the AFP. So that information is listed there for you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. We want to take a moment to recognize that we do try to meet the nationally established physician core competencies listed there. So we want to make sure that we are highlighting that for you. And then we also want to make sure we mention that our presenter, Muriel Lanford, has no financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. So I want to let her go ahead, and she's going to talk to us today about human trafficking, training for healthcare professionals and support staff.
Nicole, thank you for that introduction. I am going to get started here. Hopefully, let me know, can you see my slide all right?
Yep, I can see it.
All right, and just to let the audience know, I have had some intermittent difficulty with my microphone, so if there is any trouble hearing, Nicole's going to interrupt me, and I am ready to plug in my earbuds as needed. But thank you for having me here today. I know that this is a required topic for licensure. Oh, excuse me, let me change one of my viewing settings because it is blocking my slide. There we go. Okay. So we are going to talk today about human trafficking. We're going to talk about what it is. We're going to talk about what it isn't, and perhaps dispel some myths along the way. As healthcare providers, we are in a unique position. We're one of the few professions who are likely to interact with trafficked individuals while they are still being trafficked. I'm going to talk more about how this happens a little bit later. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to Rebecca Bender.
I was born and raised in a small town in Southern Oregon, and I was a good kid in school. I grew up in a normal middle-class family. I got great grades. I was really active in sports, and I even graduated a year early. I was accepted into Oregon State University, and I had my dorm room already assigned, and I was really excited to move up to Corvallis. But that summer I got pregnant by my boyfriend, and I had to make a real tough decision whether I was going to keep my baby and unenroll from university or get an abortion and keep it all a secret. And that was a really tough summer for me. After I had the baby, I had some friends that had gone up to U of O to go to college, and they had an extra room in one of their apartments. It was at that time that I met a boy or a guy who pretended to take interest in me. I really thought he liked me, and we got along really well. He was really funny and charming, and he had a nice car, and he always picked up the tab. He had nice clothes. He told me he was a record producer, that he had a band up in Portland, and that's why he frequently went out of town. There's a saying that says when you take a child by the hand, you take the mother by the heart. And I really think that's what happened for me, because I had this new little girl and this man who showed this desperate attention towards her, like he wanted to really help make this family that I really wanted for my daughter. And he invited me to move in with him after about 6 months of dating, and I was really excited. And I brought him down to Southern Oregon to meet my family, and everything seemed fine until we arrived in Las Vegas. He said we were moving there because that was the entertainment capital of the world, and being a record producer and having a band, that's where they were going to get the most gigs and the most jobs, and that's where his job was leading him. So I desperately wanted to go with him, to be with him, and to start this family that he promised me. He pulled up to an escort service, and he said, "This is how it works in Vegas. I've spent a lot of money to get you here. I put first and last on an apartment. I filled your fridge up with food, and you're gonna need to earn that money back." And I felt trapped. I felt like, how am I gonna get out of this? And you didn't know if you were gonna live or die. You didn't know what he was gonna do or what he was capable of, and so it was really scary. I can remember just running through the casino thinking, like, these people don't even have a clue what's going on. They're just, cha-ching, cha-ching, Las Vegas, yay! And they're doing all this stuff, and I'm running for my life. I'm running from a man that has forced me into doing things that I didn't want to do. When you have a trafficker that's waiting at home with your child and says, if you don't bring home $1,500, you're gonna find your daughter out on the corner, I think I was probably more frightened to go home than I was to be in the room. Because if you got robbed, it was your fault for being stupid. If you got raped, it was your fault for not watching your back. Anything that happened to you was typically your fault, and you incurred more punishment for allowing those things to happen to you. So it made you always walk in fear of your trafficker.
Rebecca's story is not uncommon. And I want to go over what we're going to talk about today. These are the learning outcomes. We're going to cover the major categories of human trafficking. We're going to differentiate it both from smuggling and consensual commercial sex. We'll explain the scope of the problem and help you recognize some various risk factors and red flags, and talk about appropriate interventions and strategies for healthcare practice settings. And I'll just say, as family medicine practitioners, you are in a somewhat unique position in that it is one of the more likely disciplines to see trafficking victims than, say, some of the others. These are some key terms I'm going to define as we go through the presentation. Understanding what they mean in the context of human trafficking is really critical in interacting with victims and survivors. I'm going to point out the distinction between the last two terms, even though it may seem totally obvious, but a victim is anyone who's currently experiencing trafficking, but it's also used as a legal term. A survivor is someone who's working toward healing in the aftermath of the trauma of trafficking. But it's important to understand that an individual can go back and forth between those two roles. Let's define what we're talking about right off the bat. What is human trafficking? It's defined by federal law under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. And the TVPA defines a trafficking victim as anyone induced to perform either labor or commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. That means force, fraud, or coercion must be proven in a court of law, except one big exception. In the case of minors involved in commercial sex, they are automatically considered human trafficking victims. It doesn't matter if they think they're doing it willingly. It doesn't matter if a buyer doesn't know that they're underage. By federal law, anyone who is under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex in any way, and we'll talk about what all that encompasses later, they are automatically a human trafficking victim, and we do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion in a court of law. Other than that exception that I just mentioned, I said trafficking has to involve force, fraud, or coercion. I'm going to show you some examples of each of these. We often see force as a depiction of human trafficking, but it actually is not typically the initial means of entry into human trafficking. What is much more common is fraud, where something is promised, it doesn't happen, and then the trafficker will typically maintain compliance through some means of coercion. This may be physical threats to the victim or to their family members. Either you comply, or I'm going to go home and do this to your little sister or your little brother, or I'm going to hurt your parents. It can be something as simple as psychological manipulation. Confiscation of identifying documents can also allow traffickers control. Withholding basic needs is very common. Withholding food and sleep are very often used as coercive techniques for retaining control. And again, just to emphasize, minors involved in commercial sex, we do not have to prove force or fraud or coercion. In the state of Texas, there are 4 different categories of human trafficking recognized. There is adult and minor labor trafficking. There is adult and minor sex trafficking. I'll delve more into the distinction as we go through the presentation, but the first myth or it's not really a myth, but a misunderstanding that I want to clarify is that human trafficking and human smuggling should not be confused. They're 2 distinct things. Some of you may remember a case if you were living in the area in 2017, although it even made the national news. In 2017, there was a long haul truck discovered in a local Walmart parking lot in San Antonio. It was packed with individuals who'd been brought across the border illegally. This was in the middle of summer, in the middle of July, and by the time they were discovered, sadly, a number of them had died. The press reported it as a horrific case of human trafficking, but it was not. It was a horrific case of human smuggling. So what's the difference? One is a crime against a border. The other is a crime against a person's human rights. Put another way, smuggling is illegally transporting something across a border. Trafficking is illegally buying or selling something, in this case, human beings. So just to be clear, you don't have to be transported anywhere in order to be trafficked. In fact, some victims are trafficked in their own home by caregivers or relatives. And yes, in some cases, kids are even trafficked by their parents. This is why human trafficking is often referred to as a modern day version of slavery. But is it that big of a problem, or is it just the new issue of the day? Well, normally to examine a problem, we look at data, right? Therein lies a problem with human trafficking is the data. A number of sources have tried to estimate the scope of the problem in the United States, but organizations differ, methodologies differ, and in fact, you'll find statistics kind of all over the map. The fact is, we don't know what we don't know. A significant limitation of human trafficking is that we only have data on cases that have been reported or somehow otherwise discovered, but many victims don't even realize they are being trafficked and don't understand that they are victims. Having said that, I still want to give you some context, the estimated scope of the problem here in Texas. To do that, I'm going to show you some numbers out of a study from UT Austin School of Social Work. This was done in just the last several years. If you look at this infographic that they produced, you can see trafficking is big business in the state of Texas. Look at that black bolded number in the middle, 313,000. That was the estimated number of trafficking victims in Texas on any given day, nearly 1/3 of a million people. That's what the study estimated. Look at the top, the 79,000 in purple. That was the number of estimated sex trafficking cases in Texas for minors and young adults. And that points out actually another limitation of the data. Many sex trafficking victims are exploited or trafficked as minors, but are not identified until much later, if ever, and oftentimes after they've reached the age of majority. The remaining 234,000 there in blue, right in the middle, estimated victims of labor trafficking. So the next question, obviously, so how does human trafficking actually happen? We hear lots of myths, but simply trafficking occurs because of vulnerability. What causes vulnerability? Many victims, although not all, but many victims start out with adverse childhood experiences. You've probably heard of ACEs, adverse childhood experience. Someone may be food insecure, or perhaps even homeless, or they live in poverty. Maybe they have a parent or a caregiver who has mental health issues or substance abuse issues. Or maybe they're being abused and neglected at home if they're a child living at home. To be clear though, you do not have to have any significant vulnerabilities, ACEs, to be vulnerable. With labor trafficking, The vulnerability is usually a physical need. They need to feed their family. They need a job, or they're seeking safety for their family. And traffickers are going to make promises to meet those needs. In sex trafficking, when you think about it, when we're young, we're all vulnerable when we're young, because especially as young people, we're all looking for love and affection and attention, and oftentimes romance, and we're going to get it wherever we can. In some cases, the vulnerabilities are very obvious, but in some cases, it can be something as simple as a teen who posts online that they've just had a big fight with their parent. They have now become vulnerable. And certainly there are other vulnerabilities as well. People with disabilities or mental health issues, anybody who has relationship challenges, these things can make you vulnerable. And there's certainly a number of other things. But the trafficker also is typically very good at just manipulating basic needs and desires to create a vulnerability when there was none before. In all cases, accessibility is key. Whether we're talking about labor or sex trafficking, if they're accessible, they're a potential target. And if they're online, they're accessible. I'm going to talk more about technology a little bit later. Right now, let's talk a little bit more about the difference between sex and labor trafficking, and I'm going to address labor trafficking first. Remember, labor trafficking involves force, fraud, or coercion. So what does it look like in the state of Texas? Well, based on that UT study, these were the most common types of labor trafficking found in Texas when the study was first conducted in 2016. Cleaning services or domestic servitude. This can be cleaning in a motel or in someone's private business, or it may be in someone's home in a domestic servitude situation. Food services, very common. Migrant farm workers. Agriculture is a really big business in the state of Texas. Construction, groundskeeping, and although it didn't make the top 5, there are other parts of the country where nail salons and beauty services are very common places for labor trafficking. If you happen to find a dirt cheap place to get your nails or hair done, it may be because they're not paying their employees. First misconception, I want to address a big misconception. I've heard a lot of people say this, and I used to think this as well. Well, of course, human trafficking is a big problem in Texas because we're close to the border. Nope, not really. In labor trafficking, foreign-born victims are more common, but they can be from Asia or Africa just as easily as they can from Mexico or Central America. In fact, oftentimes they will respond to an ad or accept a job offer and make their way here legally. In fact, there are studies that show a majority of labor trafficking victims actually enter the country legally on legal visas. But as I mentioned, a common form of control by traffickers is to confiscate that visa or passport, and then that victim's going to fear deportation or discovery even if they are here legally. A couple of examples. This Nigerian woman took a job as a nanny in an upscale gated community in Katy, Texas, right outside of Houston. She was forced to work 20 hours a day. She had to sleep on the floor in between the kids' beds, and the couple who hired her, her traffickers, had confiscated her visa. Fortunately, she was finally freed and they were convicted, but it was after years. This is an interesting case. This was in 2019. This was a married couple operating out of Burnett County. I don't know if any of y'all know where Burnett is, but it's a small town about 60 miles northwest of Austin. It's not part of a big metro area. It's not even a suburban community. And there's a point I want to make about that in a minute. This couple was running a supposed nonprofit for troubled boys. The problem was they were not only mistreating the boys, but they were using them as free labor for their lawn service. My point on this case is that human trafficking can and does occur anywhere, in small towns, in big cities, in wealthy neighborhoods, and poor communities. In fact, I often hear speakers talk about places that are hubs for human trafficking. The fact is, in the United States, virtually all metro areas are hubs for human trafficking, and it occurs in small communities and rural areas just in smaller numbers. Texas has continued to try to take steps to curb labor trafficking, and there are other laws that have gone into effect since this, but this is the approved presentation that we have currently now. But the last legislative session has passed several more laws, but this one was passed in 2018, and it now requires salon and cosmetology businesses to have a sign posted. So if you use these services, I would recommend you keep an eye out and look for this sign wherever you get your nails or hair done. I would tell you, when I moved out to this area about 4 years ago, I did a scope of the areas around me, the businesses around me, and of about half a dozen, the sign was not in any place obvious. In about 4 of 6 of them, it was not obvious, but it is required by law. All right, let's look at sex trafficking in the state of Texas. But before we do that, I want to address a disparity that we often see between labor and sex trafficking. You may have noticed, as evidenced by the UT study, and this has been echoed by other statistics, labor trafficking is typically considered to be a bigger problem. So why does sex trafficking get all the attention? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, when you conjure up images of sex trafficking of minors, especially young children in your mind, it's just hard for most of us to get our head around that. It's horrific. So it is going to get more compassion, typically, more media attention, and therefore more resources. However, there are also challenges on the law enforcement side for labor trafficking. While sex trafficking is under the radar, labor trafficking is way under the radar. And it tends to be more insidious because they're less likely to outcry or be discovered for several reasons. I've already said that if they're foreign-born, they're in a country, they're less likely to outcry, but if they're foreign-born, they're in a country where they may or may not have a command of the language, or they may be completely unfamiliar with the US justice system and know that they have certain rights that protect them from this happening to them. Or maybe they have little trust in law enforcement due to their circumstances back in their home country. As I mentioned, traffickers will often confiscate visas and passports in order to retain control, and victims may not know that they have any recourse. They end up feeling trapped, and as a result, for all these reasons, prosecution can be more difficult in these cases as well. Sadly, labor trafficking also sometimes gets conflated with immigration issues and politics, which can make it more challenging as well. You can't have sex and labor trafficking in the same setting, so that does occur as well. In 2019 and 2020, these were considered the top 5 sources of sex trafficking in Texas. Illicit massage and spas were number 1, followed by hotel and motel and residence-based commercial sex, and then ad venues. However, I do want to make a disclaimer here. These are numbers based on calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline because this wasn't part of that initial UT study phase. So there is somewhat of a selection bias since this is a convenience sample. We don't know who isn't calling. But I want to point out one other thing in this list. And again, this particular list was the same in 2019 and 20. We don't have 21 numbers yet. In 2018, porn made the top 5 for the first time. And in 2019, it moved up from number 5 to number 3 and is still there. And I want you to let that sink in. Pornography was the 3rd most common reason for calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline because porn is a very common avenue for sex trafficking. I really used to think that porn, until I started working in this field, I really saw porn as a victimless crime. But now we know that if you enjoy porn, chances are more likely than not, you're supporting human trafficking every time you click because clicks equals money for that trafficker. I also want to make a clear distinction between sex trafficking and consensual commercial sex or prostitution. Basically, one is voluntary and the other is not. However, that is an oversimplification. It is not always that clear cut. Are they controlling their own money, their own schedule, without any force, fraud, or coercion? Then it's probably not human trafficking. Boys or young men on the street who are engaging in survival sex are more likely than women to operate independently. But if someone has a pimp, that pimp is very often a trafficker. Are the pimps controlling the money? Are they controlling their schedule? Are they using physical abuse or threats to exert control? Are any of the sex workers not allowed to eat or sleep until they make a certain quota? Are any of them minors? If any of those things are true, that's all trafficking. It's an interesting survey done in 2008 that I'd like to share. They surveyed over 800 prostitutes, and the vast majority, nearly 90%, said they were really in the profession because they felt they had no other options. The point is, the picture of the happy prostitute who's doing it because they want to is very often a misconception, or they're doing it because they're working their way through college and making extra money. We have a lot of young people who start out doing that, who make videos and post things online to make extra money, but more often than not, they end up in an exploitive situation where they are at risk. So just to be clear, One other thing I found interesting was a study out of San Diego County. In 2016, they published this study. They did an interesting thing. They went back the most recent 2-year period before they did the study and looked at every single one of their prostitution cases in San Diego County and reviewed them all. When they went back and reviewed them, they found that fully half those cases actually met the federal criteria for human trafficking. It's likely there's probably more trafficking and less prostitution going on than is readily apparent. And I can tell you, for me personally, it's made me look at patients a little bit differently. Maybe it will for you as well. It's widely believed that the most prevalent form of sex trafficking in the United States is sex trafficking of children. Now, there are a lot of different terms used for this: child sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation of children or youth. Sometimes you'll see DMST, domestic minor sex trafficking. They all mean the same thing: sex trafficking of minors. So what exactly is child sex trafficking? To be very blunt, it's basically a seller making money by selling a product to a buyer, except the product in this case is a human being who is usually an underage US citizen. So what qualifies as commercial exploitation? It's basically anything of a sexual nature where someone is making a profit. Pornographic images, online videos, an actual sex act, stripping at a club. If anybody's making a profit of anything of the sexual nature, that is commercial sex. And in fact, by law, that buyer is also legally guilty of human trafficking. When you think about it, paying to have sex with a minor is essentially paying to rape a child. It is also human trafficking. And that is why, another reason for the exception in the federal law. I want to talk about buyers just very briefly. In the case of sex trafficking, it wouldn't even exist if there were no demand. So who is buying and using these services? We'd really like to think it's that creepy guy who lives out in that beat up trailer on the edge of town. Nobody goes out there. It will break your heart, but it's much more likely to be our neighbors and our peers and maybe the person sitting next to us in church. All of these are examples of professions who have paid to rape a minor. And remember that buyer is also guilty of human trafficking. What about kids in prostitution? Child prostitution is an oxymoron. This is a phrase that needs to go away. If a minor cannot consent to sex, how can they consent to prostitution? And again, that's the exception for minors in the federal trafficking law. Some of you may or may not have heard of Backpage.com. When it existed up until 2018, it was described as the Craigslist for sexual exploitation. And in fact, if you've lived in this area a little while, you probably recognize some street names. Now, fortunately, Backpage.com was seized by the feds. After 14 years in operation, they were finally able to seize them and convict the owners in 2018. But traffickers very quickly found other avenues to stay in business, and law enforcement still continues to try to track these guys. It's like playing whack-a-mole, though. One goes down, another one pops up. But right during the middle of the initial COVID crisis in 2020, Backpage1.com and a bigger player, CityX Guide, were both busted by the feds. So they just continue to try to track these criminals and take down what they can. Here's another myth buster. Just as with labor trafficking, in the case of sex trafficking, the border is really irrelevant. Now, unlike labor trafficking, far more sex trafficking victims are US citizens as opposed to foreign-born. And it's just as big a problem in Kansas as it is here in Texas. The border is just not a factor. These aren't typically people getting smuggled across the border to be sex trafficked. Does that happen? Occasionally, but not often compared to the many, many, many of our young people and our children who are getting trafficked. So if we focus just on the border instead of our young people and our adults, our young adults and children, we're going to miss the bigger picture. So why is that the case? When you think about it from a business perspective for the trafficker, it's a lot less costly and a lot less risky to use a homegrown product than to import one. All right, let's talk about the traffickers a little bit and how human trafficking actually happens. If we were in person, I would ask you how many of you had seen the movie Taken. This is a big misconception about sex trafficking, and this is specific to sex trafficking. Now, full disclosure here, I love Liam Neeson. I enjoy the movie. I really like him. If you didn't see the movie, Liam Neeson's young daughter, teenage daughter, gets kidnapped and exploited for sex trafficking. Liam Neeson was great. The movie was well done. The problem is that is the picture it gave the public of what trafficking looks like, sex trafficking. The problem is that is just very, very rare. It's not reality. When kidnapping occurs in the United States, it's usually a non-custodial parent taking a child. Or in the unusual case, when kidnapping occurs for exploitation, sexual exploitation, it is almost always for that individual's personal use. They're not selling them to third parties. I don't know if y'all remember Ariel Castro. He was the creepy guy in Ohio that was finally captured in 12 or 13, I think. He lured 3 young women to his house over a period of years and forcibly kept them there over a decade. Now, he sexually exploited them. He treated them horrifically, but he didn't traffic them because he didn't rent them out. He didn't share them with anybody else. So that is not trafficking. Sex trafficking is not about the creepy guy in the white panel van snatching kids out of the Walmart parking lot or off the school playground. Sex trafficking is not about a big company like Wayfair selling children online. Y'all probably heard that rumor a couple of years ago. Why? And if you didn't, it was supposedly someone started a rumor that these furniture where there was some glitch in the prices, furniture was being offered for $10,000 or whatever. And someone came up with the idea that these were actually children being trafficked. That is not the case. And the reason is simple. This is not a political statement. I volunteer in an organization where we run the political spectrum, from right to left and everything in between. And we will all tell you the same thing. That is not how traffickers work because it would be a terrible business model. Think about it. Why would you sell someone one time online for say $10,000 when you could rent them multiple times a night for years and literally make tens of millions of dollars? That is how they work because that is what makes them the most money. That is what trafficking looks like. All right. When you think about sex trafficking, when we're not having a pandemic, traffickers will target young people wherever they hang out. The mall, the local Whataburger, the Starbucks, games. We've seen traffickers pick up individuals at games and exploit them. Usually online is the most common way. And I will talk more about that a little bit more in a bit. So, oops, sorry. Let's talk about what traffickers look like. If this is the picture you get in your head when you hear the word pimp, you're not alone because this is often the depiction. But this is a guy in a pimp costume. I want to show you some real traffickers. This clean-cut looking guy, Keith Raniere. He ran a self-improvement group with some well-heeled individuals and was convicted in 2019 of human trafficking. An equally interesting fact are the people who worked with him. I don't know if anyone recognizes Allison Mack. She's an actress from TV series Smallville and some other things. She was not convicted of human trafficking, but she admitted to procuring young women for Mr. Raniere and was convicted of other charges. Claire Bronfman, if the name Bronfman rings a bell, it's because she is heiress to the Seagram's fortune. She was convicted of lesser charges, but she was bankrolling the whole organization, at least partially. Now, the rest of all these cases are from Texas. This soldier used his uniform to gain a young girl's trust, gave her a ride when it was raining, and ended up trafficking her and keeping her controlled through torture and through drugs. This young woman and her boyfriend were trafficking women between St. Louis and San Antonio. People from the San Antonio area, if you've lived here several years, you may recognize Mark Benavides because he, for years, was a prominent defense attorney here in San Antonio. He ran for judge at one point, but he was convicted in 2018 of multiple counts of human trafficking and ended up being convicted to 80 years. Why? Why the big bad case? Well, he was trafficking his clients. Oh, you can't pay? No problem. I have a side hustle for you where you can help me out, me and my friends. And that's what he was doing. This couple ran a restaurant in Waco, and they were using their Chinese connections to bring workers in from China and forcing them to work for no pay. They confiscated their visas. In fact, we had a Christian couple, yes, a Christian couple here in town in the San Antonio area who were trafficking children. So what do traffickers look like? We have a soldier We have an attorney, a prominent actress, an heiress, churchgoers. I cannot tell you what traffickers or people who associate with traffickers look like. Mark Benavides was someone's next door neighbor. And that Christian couple, they may have been sitting next to me in church on Sunday morning, and I didn't even know it. So how do traffickers actually work? Very simply, they target their victims' needs. Now, these needs can be either physical or they can just be simply psychological or emotional needs. Everybody learned about Maslow in school, and I know Maslow has been discussed and dissected ad nauseum, but the basic concept is still relevant. Your basic needs are physiological. You then have the need for safety, and we all have the need to belong and feel loved. Traffickers are usually very practiced at identifying a person's vulnerable areas and targeting their needs, and it's generally at the bottom of the pyramid. In this case, this was a sex trafficking pimp. He said, my job is to make sure she has what she needs. Personal hygiene, get her nails done, take her to buy an outfit, take her out to eat. I want to make her feel wanted, but I then will keep the money. Perfect picture. Now with labor trafficking, the lure for labor trafficking, as I said, is usually physical needs. They need a job, they need to feed their family, or they're seeking safety. There are various techniques used by labor traffickers, such as online ads or word of mouth, labor recruiters who aren't really, or just false promises. In fact, we had 2 pastors in the Fort Worth area, outside of the Fort Worth area, who were convicted of labor trafficking because they were bringing young African kids back from mission trips to Nigeria to perform in this boys' choir. And they had promised their families back home, if you will let your young boys come with us, and they were all minors, and perform, because they have beautiful voices, we will help raise money that we will send back to you and your community. We'll build a school in your community, and we will make sure your kids get an American education. None of that happened. So again, what do traffickers look like? Anybody? I want to delve a little bit more into how sex trafficking often happens with minors, either online or in person. Grooming is usually a very important component in child sex trafficking, and it can occur in young adults, but it's very common with minors. You know what grooming is, just simply preparing or training someone for a particular purpose. But when it comes to the trafficking of children, grooming is a very methodical process, and there are very specific stages that the trafficker uses, and they're very practiced at it. Initially, the trafficker is going to target vulnerabilities. We've already covered what makes people vulnerable, either someone with a true need or just someone looking for romance or adventure. Then the trafficker is going to gain trust through casual conversations, maybe on social media, or promises of romance. Victims often respond in the case of sex trafficking to someone who they think understands them or gets them or just listens to them. They have found someone who listens to them. We had one girl who said her boyfriend, who was her trafficker, opened her eyes to how controlling her mother was. That's how he got to her. Next, the trafficker is going to determine what that potential victim wants or needs the most, and they're going to meet that need or that want, that desire. Is it just that new pair of jeans? Is it that new cool game? Is it just friendship and romance? Now, as the trafficker cultivates that relationship of trust, slowly filling that potential victim's need, or they'll rapidly do that, and then slowly they will start to isolate them. Typically, after they isolate the victim slowly, abuse is usually only introduced at that point, because by now, the individual thinks this is their friend or their boyfriend. And at that point, the trafficker has complete control and the process is complete. I want you to meet James Leal. This is not a trafficking case, but a perfect example of grooming. Mr. Leal was a 41-year-old Comal County Sheriff's Deputy, and most of you probably know where Comal County is. New Braunfels is in Comal County, just north of San Antonio. He had the guts to groom his coworker's daughter when she was in middle school by volunteering to coach her sports team. She was 12. Now, he thought he was smart because he waited until she was 17, 5 years, to have sex with her, because that's the legal age in Texas, is 17. He was 41, she was 17. He ended up being arrested by the Texas Rangers because they were able to go back and prove years of grooming and manipulation. Perfect example of grooming. Everything we've talked about, all these tactics are made easier by technology, and traffickers are experts at exploiting tech. Online ads will often lure labor trafficking victims with promises of work, better wages, better conditions. With sex trafficking victims, They're oftentimes going to get false promises of money or fame. You'd be a great model, or you're really cute, or you have a great voice. For someone who hasn't been the talk of the town, this can be especially appealing. And for sex trafficking, technology also helps distance the traffickers and the buyers from the criminal activity. Traffickers can market and advertise their victims online, and buyers can make a date online instead of cruising down to the skeevy part of town. And that greatly reduces everybody's risk, except for the victim, of course. Now, social media, especially when we're talking about the sex trafficking of children, these days our kids are documenting their lives online. Many kids are. And it's very easy for exploiters to follow their target online and then figure out what it is that they want the most or need the most. And then they're going to connect with the victim and meet that desire, provide them what they want. Do you know of any kids? Have you heard of any kids who have friends online who they've actually never met in person? One other misconception I do want to address is that sex trafficking only occurs to females, or primarily females, and that is not at all the case. With girls, traffickers are more likely to use the grooming process to lure girls, but with boys, gaming apps are the primary routes for luring boys and targeting them for sex trafficking. And typically traffickers are going to target the most popular games at the time, whatever it is. It's not a small minority. It's not a small minority of sex trafficking victims who are boys. We have a local drop-in center in San Antonio where all minors who come through automatically get screened for whether they're likely being trafficked. Of those who screen positive, probable victims, 40% are males or boys. We also work with an FBI liaison here, who's a federal officer who also works with the Bexar County sheriffs, and he does nothing but investigations for sexual exploitation. We asked him one time, ratio, boys to girls, what is your experience in your investigations? And he said in his case, it's about 50-50. So the most common first step, this really struck me. We asked him, what was the most common first step? And he said, it's almost always a selfie, taking a selfie and posting it. Regardless of the process, social media is often then used to further control the victims through threats of exposure or other means of coercion. And that is why, and this is a whole nother talk I won't go into, but this is why education of our young people is absolutely critical, arming them with the knowledge to help them avoid being a victim or a target. Now, sextortion is another trafficker's tool that has evolved from technology. Whether or not you've heard the term, sextortion plays a significant role in the exploitation of minors. Meet Ashley. Ashley sent her boyfriend, Mario, some sexually explosive photos of herself, of course, thinking it was just going to him. But Mario then decides to brag about it in the locker room. He's showing his buddies and shares it with more teammates via text. Well, now it's all over the school, right? All on social media. Now, it's not sextortion yet, but the photo can end up in anyone's hands. Now, if you remember what it's like to be that age, simply having it out on social media and having everyone know and see would be enough to make me want to bury myself in a hole or move to a different country. But they may end up in the hands of a predator who wants to abuse them, or someone wanting to extort her. Send me money, or else I'm going to share these pictures with your family, with your parents, with your teachers, with your pastor, with your friends. And that's when it becomes sextortion. And many sextortioners actually carry out their threats. We had a very tragic case involving sexploitation in just the past few years, involving 14 boys in a rural county just outside of San Antonio. They were big gamers. The exploiter posed as a cute girl in the game who was wanting to romance them and help them out in the game. And let's just say it sadly ended with one boy taking his life. And it wasn't out of embarrassment or shame. It was more than that. That was what kicked him over the edge, but then it just went further. My point is, it's not an insignificant threat. Now, due to COVID for the last couple of years, many of our kids have had an increased online presence and exposure to predators and traffickers. So just watch for the signs. If you have kids in your life, educate them. And I'm happy to provide resources, suggested resources for you if anybody's interested. You're probably thinking, where's the part about healthcare providers? Where do we come in? First, especially as family medicine practitioners, be aware that you may be interacting with human trafficking victims right now. This is a study that is often quoted, and the stats are valid. In this study, 88% of the individuals who were victims said they were seen by a healthcare provider while they were being trafficked and were not identified as a victim. However, This was one small survey. The N was only 98, and it was only adult female sex trafficking victims. So it didn't include children or males or labor. And my only point on that is that other source statistics in the healthcare setting may vary. And there are other studies. But the important takeaway is just be aware that these victims may be present in our practice settings, and more practice settings than you might think. Clinics, schools, athletics fields, urgent care, dentists, all types of clinical therapy settings, just about any place you could think of. In fact, the drop-in center I just mentioned was being used by a trafficker to recruit victims. So what do we as healthcare providers, why are we in a good position to intervene? I don't know if y'all were aware, but for the last 2 decades, 20 years, even despite COVID in this last year and all the controversy with it, we as healthcare professionals are still considered the most trusted professions in the United States. Most people still tend to trust us more than others. All right, you know that human trafficking is a problem. We know it's a problem in our backyard, and that victims often intersect with healthcare providers. The next obvious question is, how would I know? This section is all about how to identify victims, but the very first thing I want you to do is get rid of your stereotypes. Victims are not just young people. Don't forget about labor trafficking. I've already mentioned both males and females are sex and labor trafficked. Victims are not just immigrants and foreigners. In fact, the majority of sex trafficking victims are actually US citizens. It's not just the poor or abused or disadvantaged. We have victims in intact families, in middle class and wealthy families, in good families, quote unquote. In fact, in the case of sex trafficking, we have seen kids who are active in church, straight A students, went to good Christian schools, 2-parent happy households, active in sports. We have seen victims in all those settings. They're often lured online. Now, it's not likely that you will ever encounter a trafficker or a buyer. If they come to see you, it's going to usually be with someone who works with or for the trafficker. You likely will interact and probably have interacted with victims and survivors. So what do they look like? Think about it from this perspective. Think about it like universal precautions. We're taught to treat everyone's bodily fluids as potentially infectious. In that same kind of way, consider the possibility that any of your patients may be a victim. And that means any man, any woman, every boy, every girl, because we don't know what they're going to look like. Knowing that, what should you look for? Well, before I cover this, indicators for human trafficking can be difficult to cover because they don't all fit into nice, neat little categories. There is absolutely crossover between indicators for human trafficking and other possible causes. So as I go through this section, what I'm going to ask you to do is just a very simple exercise. As we cover red flags and indicators, I'd like you to either jot down or at least make a mental note of any that you weren't aware of, any that you were surprised about or wouldn't have thought about, or maybe an indicator that would personally make you suspect a trafficking victim or survivor in your specific practice setting. What I'm going to cover is not all inclusive, but most red flags typically fall into one of these ABCs: their appearance, their behavior, or their communication, how they're communicating. And let's face it, even if it's not human trafficking, if your spidey sense tells you that something is not right, typically someone needs help. What I'm simply asking you to do is to keep trafficking in your differential. These findings should be familiar to all of us. Typical signs and symptoms of neglect and abuse, we certainly are taught this, to look for wounds in various stages and unexplained injuries. With inconsistent or scripted stories, I don't know about y'all, but I have found that in my practice, my background is trauma and ER and such, in the last 35 such years, I have found that if the story doesn't match the clinical picture, there are frequently 3 common causes: either physical or emotional abuse is going on, or substance abuse, or criminal activity, or some combination of those. Any untreated medical issues, acute or chronic, or indications of delayed medical treatment. Neglected medical issues can certainly be signs of control by another party, but as you know, it can also be poverty or mental health issues, which can confound the picture. Just be alert, be a little suspicious, and look for other findings. Other acute or chronic findings, such as signs of trauma, old or new, GI issues, new or chronic. Headache is a common chief complaint with victims and survivors. Sometimes they will come in with that as their chief complaint, and sometimes abdominal pain. Now, we tend to obviously take abdominal pain more seriously, but don't automatically write off a headache if you notice there might be other suspicious indicators. If physical abuse is suspected, consider the possibility of the effects of repetitive head trauma. We're starting to look for CTE in some abuse victims. Poor dental health or oral or dental injuries are another one. In terms of behaviors, that's kind of their appearance. Are they a poor historian? Are they avoiding eye contact or really withdrawn or seem fearful? If you're in a situation where there's law enforcement around, does that make them very visibly uncomfortable? You may see someone who comes across very hypervigilant or very subordinate. Now, I kind of had to wedge this in there to fit this into behavior, but as I mentioned, traffickers will often retain ID as a form of control. When a victim comes in, they may not know where they are, and I mean location as in town. Sometimes they'll say the red flag is not knowing what day it is. I don't think that's fair. I don't always know what day it is. But if they don't know what town they're in, that may be an indicator. Or perhaps they're unable to give an address for their residence. Maybe they claim to be visiting, just passing through. And that's not information you're typically going to be privy to. This is why your front desk people or your registration people or whoever sees them first should be alert to this. While you don't have to be transported to be trafficked, there are both labor trafficking and sex trafficking victims who are on a circuit regularly going to different places. Communication, just be mindful of nonverbal cues. Is the patient especially submissive to someone who's with them? And this may be a controlling or domineering adult, again, usually not the trafficker, but somebody working for them or with them. And it may be an older adult, or it may be someone closer in age to that patient, may even be another victim. And they may claim this person is their sister, their cousin, or their uncle, or their aunt. But that person may be trying to control the conversation or not allow the person to speak for themselves. And if, as good practitioners, we try to get the patient to speak for themselves. Well, if the patient is allowed to speak, perhaps they seem nervous or they keep glancing at that person with them as if they're trying to stick to a script. These are more specific to labor trafficking. Do you happen to discover that they live where they work? Well, if they don't own the business, that can be a big red flag. Do they have personal ID documents? I just mentioned, whether it be driver's license, visa, passport, whatever. And again, as practitioners, we're typically not going to know this, but make sure your front desk people know to relay that information to you as the provider if this is something that they see as suspect. Labor trafficking, I said, more often, not always, remember the little boys in Burnett County, but more often they are foreign born and there may be a language barrier, they may be in the US recently, which can put them at greater risk. With labor trafficking, they're typically going to be more fearful of authorities, as I said. Sex trafficking survivors are as well. Labor trafficking are typically more afraid because they're afraid of deportation if they don't have their papers. Maybe you see signs of dehydration or exhaustion or untreated injuries that could be work-related. Let's say you have a patient who comes in, and I don't know what your practice settings are, but maybe you have someone who comes in from some significant trauma after falling from a platform at work. And maybe it's obvious that the treatment has been delayed in getting to you. If the worker has no ID papers, oh, my employer has it, that's a big red flag. Or maybe they don't know their employer's full name or how to contact them. Maybe they don't seem to have any knowledge of workers' rights when you ask, is it a workers' comp case? Or the front desk asks, is it a workers' comp case? And they have no idea what they're talking about. That, a language barrier, these are all things that add up to a big red suspicious question mark. Maybe in the case of labor trafficking, you see indicators of a dangerous work environment that would be unlikely in the age of OSHA. Maybe they're working in an enclosed space with toxic substances, without ventilation and no PPE. Or maybe you have someone who you see signs of excessive sun exposure, respiratory issue with signs of chemical exposure or organophosphate symptoms, chronic musculoskeletal problems. These may be unsafe conditions in an agricultural setting. Those are some labor trafficking indicators. Let's talk about things that are more specific to sex trafficking. And this is something where I really have had to come to grips with my own previous practice. If we're not considering other explanation, it can be really easy to categorize these people as hookers or delinquents or promiscuous or a user or frequent flyers. And I have probably used every one of those descriptions in my career. Y'all are probably familiar with how things operate in ER and other critical care units. But I've really started to look at these patients differently in the last few years. Is their attire or behavior overly sexual for their age or what they say their age is? It's very easy to write that off as promiscuity if we're not thinking beyond that, or if they just look younger than they're telling you they are. Maybe the clothing for the weather is all wrong. Maybe it's the heat of summer and they're covering up their injuries or other signs of distress. Or maybe it's, cold outside and they've got nothing on. Sometimes you will even see them come across as overly confident or maybe even brash as a protective mechanism. For me, it would be really easy for me to write that patient off as having an attitude. And I've already written them off as delinquent, and then I'm going to dismiss them. Prominent tattoos can be a key red flag in any number of locations. They may be obvious, they may be hidden. We've seen them everywhere, on the back of the neck, inside the lower lip. Common signs of ownership can be the word daddy, a crown, money symbols or symbols of power. We've even seen UPC codes on some individuals. Does the patient seem fearful or nervous when they can't immediately answer a text or call? That's a red flag. And drug use is often used by traffickers as a means to control, and some are just self-medicating. Do they have a history of multiple STIs or have an abortion at early age, or maybe multiple ABs? It's really easy to write that off to prostitution or promiscuity. But remember, if it's a minor and they're involved in commercial sex in any way, it's trafficking. Recent studies have shown that a significant percentage of sex trafficking victims have been strangled or asphyxiated during their abuse. Do you see signs of petechial hemorrhage or any kind of image imprint or other signs of trauma to the neck? Just as with any clinical signs and symptoms, it's very easy to write off any particular finding, but sometimes it requires putting them all together to see a suspicious pattern. And keep this in mind too. As family practitioners, you're probably more likely to work in settings where you see repetitive visits. And these red flags may not become apparent till the third or fourth or even 10th visit, or maybe even months later. I know I've covered a lot of information and indicators. And by the way, I'm happy to share my PDF of my slide deck if anyone wants it. There are a lot of indicators to consider, but just to make it harder, sometimes there are none. This was a young lady discovered during the UT study, and she said to the public nothing was wrong with her. She said, I was very active in school, in sports, and theater, and her traffickers made her continue all those activities. They controlled her social media and her phone, so it would appear that nothing in her life had changed. People who are being trafficked are not always missing. Some of them actually go home every day, and that's a little bit scary. Something I didn't mention earlier regarding missing kids. Not only are some of them not reported missing because they're being trafficked while they're living at home, but we have been told by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that 90% of all children who are missing go with their exploiter willingly because they know them or they think they know them. They met them online. That's a lot. Long-term consequences obviously are numerous, and time prevents us from covering these in depth, but the state does require us to cover some. So I'm going to go through a few quickly. Certainly, chronic, repetitive, or untreated disease, illness, or injury can cause problems. But also, when you think about anyone who experiences repetitive trauma, think about the effects of persistent cortisol release. It can lead to persistent serotonin suppression, making a greater contribution to the likelihood of anxiety and agitation. It will ultimately affect metabolism and glucose control. It's going to suppress the immune system over time and affect the GI system. And ultimately, if long enough period of time, it can ultimately become toxic to brain cells. Cortisol release over a long term, as you know, can be destructive. Now, in addition, I mentioned that sleep deprivation is a common means of control for victims. Well, sleep deprivation, as you're probably aware, further increases cortisol production. Victims aren't getting 3 square meals a day. They're going to be less likely to heal well, more likely to be susceptible to illness and infection and other things. For sex trafficking victims, sexual dysfunction, sometimes irreparable reproductive damage can occur. In addition to long-term physical problems, victims will often develop cognition and learning barriers, as well as executive function impairment. Think about this happening in a developing brain, which we know doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25. So you have that part of the brain that's governing judgment, rational thought, communication, emotional self-regulation that is affected. That's going to be another barrier that's going to make it hard for them to communicate with us in some cases. Self-medication, as you can imagine, is very common and multiple on mental health. In fact, poor mental health is one of the most dominant and persistent effects, adverse health effect, associated with human trafficking. Depression is extremely common. PTSD is a fairly good possibility. Eating, anxiety disorders. Another long-term mental health consequence can be trauma bonding, which is a psychological bond with their exploiter. And I'll talk about that in just a moment and define that for you. So you know human trafficking is a problem. Hopefully you have a few more clues on how to identify it. Now, what do you do with that information? First, and this is important, recognize your own potential barriers because we all have them. I've already talked about resisting stereotypes, but one of the biggest barriers I've encountered since starting this state-approved version a year and a half ago is people believing it won't happen in their practice setting. And I will confess to you, I have fallen prey to this thinking. When I first started doing the state-approved version, because we were educating people prior to that, but then we submitted to the state to get an approved version. When I first started doing this, I gave this talk to a group of physical therapists. And I thought in my head, well, I know they have to by law, but it's probably not going to apply to physical therapy, right? I got a call from their owner the following day, and she told me that shortly after this training, one of their physical therapists had identified a victim and were able to get him help. And I felt so embarrassed because I thought, here I am, not even following my own advice. I've had athletic trainers and faith-based schools tell me it's not relevant for them. Victims have been identified in those settings. And this may be the very reason that we're missing them. We think it doesn't happen in our backyard or our workspace. I assure you it is, and it does. All right, next, watch your affect and your body language. That's kind of a no-brainer, but while this applies to all our patients, we need accurate information from our patients. To do that, we need to develop some kind of relationship, even though sometimes we may have 2 minutes to do so. And I understand that. With some of it, it's a very, very short time frame. It does not take any additional time to look a patient in the eye, to smile, and to just act kindly to them. Avoiding a judgmental approach. Now, obviously, I don't think any of us are going to do that intentionally, but speaking for myself, when I get busy, especially when I was working in the ER, I would get so busy and focused, I could come across very matter of fact, to the point. And I had to really watch myself. This was interesting. Remember the study I told you about 98 sex trafficking victims, 88% of whom said they were seen by a healthcare provider not identified. The surveyor asked, why didn't you outcry? Why didn't you self-identify? And the vast majority said it was because they felt judged by the healthcare provider. Think about how often I have done this, talk about or treat our frequent flyers, our delinquents, our hookers, our users. Everyone has a story. You don't need to know everybody's story, but you need to know that everyone has one. I want you to think about a personal experience. And I guess I wish I could go back and apologize to some of my patients. Think about a personal experience that you may have had. Let's say at a restaurant or a store, and you didn't like the way you were treated, and you said, I'm never going back there again. Now think about an issue this personal and this sensitive. If you felt judged or disrespected or just a lack of compassion, would you ever go back? I doubt it. We must try to create a safe environment for them in the very short time that we have with them. Remember, Maslow's safety is right after meeting of physical needs. Now, I know we're supposed to screen for everything. Obviously, it can be overwhelming, but again, it doesn't take long to just be aware and to act kindly. One thing we can do is communicate hope. Sounds a little hokey, but this is a survivor-informed approach. That is what this is. This was taken from a survivor and suggestions from a survivor. Now, all these concepts aren't going to apply in every scenario, and you certainly don't need to use these specific statements. But when it's appropriate, try to communicate the appropriate sentiment. Listen to them. Are you just looking at your chart? Are you focusing on that digital screen in front of you? I've had a bad habit of doing that. Don't just look at your patient, see them, look them in the eye. Maybe they take the couple of extra seconds to get on eye level and sit down. And I tell you what, when I'm in a rush, that can be hard to do. But listen, just take a few seconds to listen to what they're saying and to what they're not saying. Now, a word of caution to some of you, because some of you are going to walk out of here thinking, you know what, I'm going to try to pay more attention now. I'm making sure I'm coming across kind and compassionate. I'm not coming across judgmental. It is not always easy. As a result of what they're going through or have been through as a victim, it can be difficult to communicate with them. And in fact, sometimes their coping mechanisms can even make them rather unpleasant to deal with. I'm just asking you to try not to let that discourage you. It's not always easy to identify victims because they have barriers as well. Many don't realize they are victims. It's not uncommon for them to have been mislabeled as criminals instead of victims. And victims are often trained to tell scripted stories or lies to avoid detection. They're taught not to trust authority, to feel shame or that it's their fault. And in fact, with our victims, the young survivors who we work with, that is one of the most common reasons that they said they didn't outcry, is they felt like it was their fault. Well, they went with them, or they choose to respond to this, or they connected with them on social media. And one of the barriers they have is trauma bonding. And I want to mention this just very quickly. But when there is ongoing control or abuse within a relationship, a trauma bond can form. Usually it's when there's an uneven power dynamic and one person is unable to escape. When I say unable to escape, not necessarily physically, but psychologically or emotionally. Simply put, a trauma bond is a complex emotional relationship where victims develop feelings of trust and even affection for the very people who are abusing them. It's important for us to understand that this is actually a survival strategy. If you haven't heard of Stockholm Syndrome, and I imagine many of you have, but if you haven't, look it up. Very, very brief consensus cliff notes. During a multi-day standoff, hostages in a bank robbery in Sweden bonded with their captors enough that some of them defended their captors and refused to testify against them in court. And in that situation, you had a hostile taking of individuals by strangers for a period of time. Would it be hard then to stretch the imagination and think how that relationship could develop with someone who goes with their exploiter willingly initially? When you think about it, everyone wants to be loved. For some victims, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking, to break free of the trauma bond means letting go of the fantasy of being loved in some cases. Everyone wants to be treated kindly, whether we're talking about labor or sex trafficking. No matter how little we get, if it's in short supply, we're going to get it wherever we can. And traffickers are typically very good at the development of these trauma bonds, and they will typically alternate small acts of kindness and caring with threats and abuse to keep them connected to them. All right, beyond recognizing barriers, what is our role as healthcare providers? Obviously, it's going to depend on your specific role or your position at your organization. Before you can answer that question, what should I do? You need to know the answer to these questions. And at UT Health, you probably have access to a few more resources than some other individuals. Do you all have some type of policy or protocol? Do you have a screening tool for trafficking and staff trained to use it? And do you know how to access sexual assault nurse examiners? The latter, I imagine you do, but some you may or may not have all these. Regardless of those answers, the important thing is that we establish trust and rapport. That's what's critical, trust and rapport. Yes, in that 2 minutes that you have. If you do have a protocol, the answer is straightforward. Follow it and use the resources you have. But many places don't have a policy or any kind of procedure, and that might be a starting point for you or someone in the organization. But always use a trauma-informed approach. I want to talk briefly about trauma-informed care. It is a victim-centered approach, and it is not just the latest buzz phrase in patient care. I know we've had those through the years, but this is an evidence-based practice. And the primary guiding principle is safety. Above all, the goal of trauma-informed care is to avoid re-traumatization and to not blame or criminalize the victim. I'm going to show you a video clip that provides a fairly good overview of a trauma-informed approach in a general healthcare setting.
You know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, the same is true when you assess a patient. Hi, I'm Dr. Cruz. Early in my career, I noticed a pattern with some of my patients. They often had multiple health issues, were uneasy during office visits, and frequently visited the emergency department. But worst of all, they never got better despite multiple visits. Then I realized something. From an early age, many of my patients were exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This includes emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, violence, neglect, discrimination, poverty, and other adverse events. ACEs are more common in the US than you'd think. In fact, 60% of US adults have one ACE, 25% have 3 or more ACEs, and 16% have 4 or more. ACEs occur in all socioeconomic groups, but are more common in low-income and minority populations. For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. So as they grow up, many struggle with issues related to emotional regulation, like depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders. Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, "What's wrong with you?" I ask, "What happened to you?" Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
Regardless of how many or how few resources you have, as healthcare providers, we should always be looking for red flags of everything, right? We're trying to look for signs and symptoms of everything else. But when we encounter indicators or symptoms that the patient communicates, document. Documentation is your best legal tool to assist a victim. Now, I do have some people who are concerned that once they've had this training, that they're going to be expected to do an interview of the victims. And the answer is absolutely not. Unless you have had specific training, leave any investigative work for appropriate agencies or personnel. In fact, you can ask them open-ended questions such as, is there anything else you'd like to share? But never probe for details of their trauma. That can actually cause re-traumatization. It's important to communicate in their language and their vocabulary. For instance, if they refer to the person that you think is exploiting them as their boyfriend, don't try to correct them. Just knowing some of the basic terms and allowing them to communicate in their words is helpful. And I have a list of these and give you a reference if you're interested. And I'll share my email at the end. Of utmost importance, try to assure the patient feels safe. I know I keep using that word, but it's important. There are going to be different approaches, certainly, that are different and appropriate in different settings. These suggestions might be for a private physician's office, for a clinic. If you need to safely separate them from the person with them, you can come up with all sorts of things. I need you to complete some paperwork at the front desk. I've used HIPAA as an excuse. You know that HIPAA federal law, it says you can't be in the room when I'm talking about this. Make up that you need a UA or an x-ray, whether you do or not, if it can fit into the clinical picture. I even know of some clinicians or physicians' offices specifically, and they will have different colored pens or dots that they will place in the bathroom. And before the patient goes in, they'll place a sign in there, say, if you need help, put a red dot on the container. Be creative, but those are just some simple things you might be able to do to safely separate them from the person with them. With interpreters, it's so tempting to use a family member or person with them, but we just can't. Hospitals are required to have professional interpreters, but if you're working outside the hospital, just know what your protocol is. Do you have simply an assigned staff member who's trained in confidentiality and is comfortable with sensitive topics? Just know what your plan is ahead of time. If you're speaking through an interpreter, use best practices. Talk a little bit slower in shorter segments, not louder, obviously. Make sure you keep eye contact with the patient, not the interpreter, but tell the interpreter to make sure to alert you to any cultural misunderstandings or issues as well. The state requires that we cover some intervention tools. I'm going to just give you a couple. These are both evidence-based. One is the CUES tool, confidentiality, which is, of course, with all our patients. Universal education, information you would share with any patient. And I understand, again, many of you are going to have very brief interactions, and universal education may not be possible. But if someone's coming in repetitive visits and you can take a couple extra minutes, that can be helpful. Educate and empower them and support them. Disclosure is not the goal. And I'll cover that more in a minute, but disclosure is not the goal, even though that's hard for us. I like this tool simply because it was developed by a survivor advocate who works in the healthcare system out west. Provide a safe private space for the person. Use non-judgmental education. Instead of making your patient feel singled out, that you're educating them on a topic because of such and such. You can easily say something like, I educate all my patients on, and then say what you need to say. Allow them time to ask questions or discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to share? And respect their response. If the patient declines to engage, respect that. Don't push, don't probe. Now, screening tools are different than intervention-based tools that we just talked about. Here are the challenges with screening tools. Number one, they're not all validated. This one is, it's called the See It tool. But the other thing you need to know about screening tools is they should not be utilized without training. Don't let somebody hand you a tool and say, hey, we're using this now. You need to be trained. With screening tools, they're usually geared towards specific populations of patients or screeners. I am not going to go then into detail on specific tools because they will be organization-based. Just know that you need training in order to use it. I want to make a mention of ICD-10s because all of you are physicians or advanced practice practitioners, I assume. ICD-10 codes now include both suspected and confirmed cases of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking. So use these when you can. As healthcare professionals, of course, we're mandatory reporters by law. If you're reporting a case of suspected trafficking, you're required, obviously, to report to CPS if it's someone who's a minor, but use the word trafficking if that's what you're concerned about, because your phrasing may send the case to a specific task force or a specific officer, and oftentimes have a different priority, especially if we're talking about minors. Now, mandatory reporting, I think, is pretty clear to all of us, but reporting PRN is a bit different. Reporting is mandatory if there's an outcry, or if the patient describes to you a situation where they clearly outline force, fraud, or coercion is happening. But most victims will not outcry, and many will not even consider themselves victims. Do not try to convince them that they are. That's not our job. If you have a concern, call law enforcement in your jurisdiction and ask to speak with someone who works with trafficking cases. Now, other than emergency situations, you should call non-emergency law enforcement. I live in Bexar County. I keep Bexar County Sheriff's number in my hand, in my phone. I don't live in San Antonio. I live in a community within Bexar County. So I keep local PD's number in my phone and the human trafficking hotline, which I'll mention in a moment. Now, outside metro areas, and I realize there are some of you outside the metro area, your resources may be more limited. And I'll talk about a way for you to access those in a minute. If you're dealing with school-age children, you may have to involve school district police. They need to be involved. But again, use the phrasing that will get you the attention you think it warrants. Unless if you're outside your work environment, you might need to call 911, but it's rare that you're going to need to call 911. If you're not sure, by all means call. The state requires us to cover implications when law enforcement needs to be involved. So I'm going to cover these quickly. They should be obvious, but we do need to cover them. Victims are often told by the trafficker that law enforcement will arrest and incarcerate them. And in fact, many of them have probably had this happen because I have either engaged in voluntarily or involuntarily in criminal activity, whether it be drugs, drug use, or perhaps they're arrested for prostitution when they're really being trafficked, or perhaps they're arrested for illegal immigration when they're really here legally, but they don't have access to their papers. They're usually told no one's going to care. The other risk with law enforcement is re-traumatization is always an issue. And if you have law enforcement who's used to dealing with victims, they'll understand that. But law enforcement's like every other profession. You're going to have some who are better trained than others. Just be prepared. I've mentioned the human trafficking hotline. You really need to have someone call them too. If you don't have, we're not allowed to delegate reporting in the case of abuse, but you can delegate this if you don't have time. Would strongly recommend you calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Why? It's a national database for receiving calls and logging suspected trafficking cases, and the hotline staff is trained and they will provide information to law enforcement in the appropriate jurisdiction. One advantage they have is they can sometimes track activity and connect dots that follow across multiple jurisdictions, which is more difficult for law enforcement. They don't know what's going on in St. Louis. And in fact, that St. Louis to San Antonio case, that's one of the ways they were caught, is the trafficking hotline said, hey, this sounds just like the case going on in St. Louis, connected law enforcement in those two cities, and boom. Now, if the patient wants help, you can certainly hand them the phone and document that. But let's say you're calling, you don't have patient consent. You obviously can't release any PHI, protected health information, but you can call the trafficking hotline with hypotheticals and request resources and guidance. You can also provide them information about the person with that patient because they are not the patient. Texas is the first state to develop a formal partnership with the hotline, which has helped facilitate investigations and hopefully is leading to more arrest. The National Human Trafficking Hotline also has victim resources. And you'll notice I wrote the number kind of funny there, just because it's easier to remember when it's written that way. But you can also call, or a victim can text them to get resources. You can provide that information to them if necessary. Thinking about healthcare support services, think about in advance who might be part of your team. Put this team together in advance. Social workers and psychologists, some of you are going to have access to those. Do you have trauma-informed staff? I would guess you probably don't know. Most of us don't know. Sexual assault nurse examiners, rape crisis center. Make those connections, find out what the process is, and pull those resources in ahead of time. I gave this talk, I've given this talk a couple of times to Texas Med Clinic, and they have created a spreadsheet for different organizations and resources to call with labor and sex trafficking. Victim resources in your area. Do you have any other resources for victims and survivors? If you don't know, you can do one of two things. You can contact our organization or find our information online because we have a number of resources, not just our own, but area resources about it. Or you can talk to a social worker or case manager. Or for those of you who are outside the metro area, if you go to the National Human Trafficking Hotline's website, they have a zip referral directory with a zip code search. You can put in your zip code. Regardless, know how to make referrals for victim services and who in your organization will do that, because that will help expedite getting them help. This is a guide developed by a survivor that I just love, and it's designed for healthcare interactions with suspected victims. Number one, always believe them. And she put that first because sadly, we have had so many reports where a victim had actually outcried or described a situation to a healthcare provider and weren't believed. That may be an issue, why we need to pay attention more. In those crazy stories, I gave this talk to EMS fellows over at UT Health, the fellowship program. And one of the residents, or one of the fellows came on, was telling his resident, this sounded like a crazy story, but it was so crazy, it may be true. They investigated and found out it was a case of labor trafficking. So if it's crazy, believe them. Provide resources only if they want them. Never place resources in a patient's belongings without their permission, because you may be endangering them. But affirm them and give them a voice and listen without judgment. Empower them to make their own decisions. And again, many victims will not self-identify, will not outcry, or not be willing to accept help. That is okay. As hard as that is for us, That is okay. All right, let's wrap things up. And if you want any more information, I'm happy to provide any more information for you on resources or anything like that. But to wrap up, summarize, gain their trust, make them feel safe. There's that safe word again. Be observant, document, and report as necessary. That's just being a good clinician. The same thing you would for your other patients. Now, do remember, it's not your job to save the patient. It's your job to create a safe and trusting environment, to report to law enforcement and involve them when it's appropriate, and to provide victim-centered care. It's also our role to know what our community resources are. But outside of that, the rest is really up to the patient. So what is success in this scenario? I don't want you to feel like you have failed if you know something's wrong and the patient just won't disclose. You have not failed. Why? What is most important? It's whether or not they are receptive to your interaction. It's that you've made them feel safe and welcome to return. And really, we should be doing that for everybody, right? Success is not identification. Success is that people will have a positive experience in the healthcare setting and see it as a safe place to disclose if and when they are ready. I have a short trailer. I am not going to show it to you because I want to allow a couple of minutes for questions. But if you have time, I would suggest you go online to the Texas Attorney General's website and watch at least the trailer, if not the whole video, called Be the One. I know the opinion on state politics are widely divided by now, but this was put out by the state human trafficking team and does a good job of representing human trafficking in the state of Texas. So Be the One is what it's called. This is a really tough subject. I want you to know there is hope. Here is proof. I wanted to end on a positive note and tell you these are individuals who have not just survived, but have found a way to survive and thrive post-trafficking. This is only going to continue to be a problem if we have academic and public and professional indifference. So with that, that is all I have for you. If you want to reach out to me, if I can answer any other questions on resources or anything like that, Nicole also has my information. I do want to give a quick shout out to our partners at Ransom Life, which is who I volunteer with. And they are the reason that we are able to be supported in doing this at no charge to your organization. So with that, I'm going to close it out and see if you have any questions. All right, let me look at the chat and see if there were any questions there. Nicole, did you notice any questions?
I didn't. I think it was mostly just me letting everybody know about the session today, the credits, and to register for CME. I would like to make sure if everybody could also fill out the evaluation for today's for today's session. But if anybody would like to unmute and comment.
And I'm going to type my email in the chat box in case you want it. And thank you for your feedback. I, again, would be happy to field any questions you may have. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. We wanted to work hard. My colleague and I created this. We had attended several other presentations, and we really wanted this to be particularly for you to feel like it's relevant for you as a practitioner in the state of Texas into our world. Any questions? Anything else I can do? Okay. Nicole, I would appreciate any feedback that you receive when you are able to compile the CME evals. I would appreciate that.
Yes, ma'am. Happy to.
Again, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate your attentiveness and being willing to have us on and talk to you today.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you. And thank you, Nicole.